The wind howled across the dusty plains as the woman stumbled toward the ranch gates, her tattered shawl flapping behind her like a wounded bird. In her trembling arms, a small bundle whimpered, a baby, frail and fevered. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes hollow from nights without sleep. She clutched the gatepost for balance and cried out, her voice breaking against the vast silence. "Please," she begged, her words barely audible over the wind. "Please, someone help us." The old wooden door creaked open, and a tall figure appeared, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and wary. The rancher squinted at the desperate woman before him. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this ain't no place for beggars." But when the woman lifted the blanket and the baby's weak cry pierced the cold morning air, something in his heart stirred. The rancher's name was Jacob Hollis, a man who'd seen too much loss to care for strangers. His wife had died 3 winters ago, and since then, he'd buried his kindness beneath layers of silence and hard work. Yet the sight before him, this trembling widow clutching her child, felt like a wound reopening. "Please," the woman whispered again. "My baby's burning up. I've got nowhere else to go." Her words sank into him like the weight of the world. He hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. Finally, he stepped aside and motioned her in. "Bring him in the barn," he muttered. "We'll get a fire going." As she followed him, her tears fell like rain on the dusty ground, a quiet prayer of gratitude whispered into the wind. Inside the barn, the warmth of the fire slowly breathed life back into the freezing air. Jacob poured water into a tin cup, handing it to her without meeting her eyes. The baby's cheeks were flushed red with fever, his breath shallow and fast. "What's his name?" Jacob asked gruffly. "Samuel," she said softly. "He's all I have left." Her voice trembled as she explained how her husband had died in a mining accident, how the landlord had thrown her out, how she'd walked for miles hoping to find help. Jacob listened in silence, his rough hands gripping the edge of the table. When she finished, the room felt heavy with unspoken pain. "You can stay the night," he finally said. "But just till the boy's better." She nodded gratefully, not daring to hope for more. The night dragged on, and the baby's condition worsened. Jacob found himself pacing, fetching water, wringing cloths, things he hadn't done since his wife fell ill. Memories of her last fever came rushing back, the same helplessness, the same fear. When Samuel's tiny body convulsed in the early dawn, Jacob panicked. "He's not breathing right," the widow cried. Jacob grabbed his coat. "I'll fetch Doc Harris," he said. "He's 2 miles east." Without another word, he mounted his horse and galloped into the gray morning. The wind tore at his hat, the cold bit into his skin, but he didn't slow down. He didn't even realize the tears streaming down his face until he reached the doctor's cabin. Doc Harris was old and half-retired, but Jacob's urgency pulled him from bed. Within minutes, they were riding back to the ranch. The doctor examined Samuel under the flickering lantern light, his brows furrowed. "The boy's lungs are weak," he said. "He'll need rest, warmth, and good milk." Jacob nodded, silently vowing to provide all 3. The widow, clutching her son, looked up at Jacob with tearful eyes. "You saved him," she whispered. Jacob shook his head. "No, ma'am, not yet, but we'll do what we can." The doctor left by afternoon, leaving behind medicine and instructions. As the door closed, the silence between Jacob and the widow softened into something fragile, trust, maybe even hope. Days turned into weeks. The widow, whose name was Clara, worked around the ranch to repay Jacob's kindness. She mended his torn shirts, cooked meals, and helped tend to the animals. Samuel slowly grew stronger, his laughter beginning to echo through the farmhouse. For the first time in years, the sound of life filled Jacob's home again. He'd catch himself smiling without meaning to, watching Clara hum lullabies by the fire. But each time warmth crept into his heart, he'd shove it away. He'd built walls around himself for a reason. Still, one evening, when Clara thanked him for everything, he only grunted in reply, though his eyes lingered on her longer than he intended. Winter settled heavy over the plains, turning the world white and silent. Supplies ran low, and the nearest town was nearly snowed in. Jacob worked from dawn to dusk, chopping wood, fixing fences, keeping the animals alive. Clara insisted on helping, but the cold bit at her hands until they bled. "You should rest," Jacob said one evening. "You'll get sick." She smiled weakly. "I've been through worse." Yet that night, he found her coughing beside the dying fire, too exhausted to move. He carried her to bed, tucking a blanket around her shoulders. "You saved my boy," she murmured. "Now you're saving me too." Jacob didn't reply, but when she closed her eyes, he stayed by her side until dawn. Clara's fever broke after 3 long days. When she finally woke, Samuel was curled beside her, and Jacob was asleep in a chair, still holding her hand. She looked at him for a long time, tears brimming. This man, so rough, so broken, had given her back everything she'd lost: hope, safety, and a reason to believe again. When Jacob stirred awake, their eyes met in a silence that said more than words could. "You should have let go," she whispered. "You didn't owe us anything." Jacob looked away, his voice gruff. "Maybe I needed saving too." And in that simple sentence, something inside both of them healed a little. As spring approached, the ranch began to breathe again. Calves were born, fields thawed, and sunlight spilled across the land. Clara took to tending the garden, while Samuel followed Jacob everywhere, toddling behind him with childish curiosity. "He likes you," Clara said one afternoon, smiling as Samuel tugged at Jacob's boot. "Can't say I'm used to that," Jacob chuckled. He lifted the boy into his arms, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease. The simple warmth of a child's laughter filled the hollow places in his heart. For the first time since his wife's death, Jacob allowed himself to imagine something new, a future, maybe even a family. But the peace didn't last. One stormy night, a group of men rode up to the ranch, Clara's landlord and his thugs. "She owes back rent," the man sneered. "We've come to collect." Clara froze, clutching Samuel. "I paid what I could," she stammered. The landlord laughed cruelly. "You paid nothing. And now you're trespassing." Jacob stepped between them, his jaw set like stone. "You'll leave this property," he said evenly, "before I make you." The man smirked. "You'd protect a beggar and her brat." Jacob's eyes burned. "That beggar saved my life," he said quietly. The standoff ended when Jacob's shotgun gleamed in the lightning's flash, and the men retreated into the storm. After that night, Clara realized something had changed. Jacob was no longer just a rescuer, he was her protector, her partner in struggle. She tried to leave the next morning, afraid of burdening him further, but when she reached the gate, he called after her. "Clara," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "if you want your boy safe, then stay." She turned, her tears glistening in the sunrise. "You don't mean that," she whispered. But he did. Every word. The silence between them filled with the promise of a new beginning, fragile but real. Slowly, she walked back toward him, Samuel nestled in her arms. Life on the ranch was not easy, but it was theirs. Together they repaired fences, sowed seeds, and rebuilt what had once been broken. Clara taught Jacob to laugh again, to find beauty in small things, the way the sun lit the hayfields, the smell of fresh bread baking, Samuel's giggles chasing through the rooms. And Jacob taught Clara that strength could be quiet, that love didn't have to be loud to be true. They learned to heal, not by forgetting their pain, but by sharing it. The loneliness that once haunted the ranch gave way to laughter and warmth, a testament to second chances. Years passed, and Samuel grew tall and strong, the kind of boy who worked hard and smiled often. He called Jacob, Pa, before either of them realized when it began. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Clara took Jacob's hand. "You could have turned us away that day," she said softly. Jacob looked at her, his eyes distant but full. "I almost did," he admitted. "But something in me knew, maybe saving you was the only way to save myself." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in his life, Jacob felt truly home. The ranch flourished, not because of wealth, but because of love. Neighbors began to visit again, drawn by the kindness that radiated from the Hollis place. Travelers found food and shelter there, just as Clara once had. When they asked why he helped strangers, Jacob would smile faintly and say, "Because once, someone begged me to save a baby, and I learned saving one life can save your own." His words carried across the years, a simple truth born from hardship and grace. Clara often thought back to that first night, when she'd stood at his gate in the cold, clutching her dying son. She'd been sure it was the end. But it had been a beginning she couldn't yet see. Fate had a strange way of weaving redemption through despair, and she thanked God every morning for the man who'd opened his door. Sometimes she'd watch Jacob and Samuel working together and feel her heart swell with quiet joy. Love had grown in the most unlikely soil, beneath hardship, loss, and pain. One evening, as the sun sank low, Samuel asked, "Ma, what would have happened if Pa hadn't taken us in?" Clara smiled through tears. "Then we'd have missed the miracle waiting for us," she said. Sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to say, "Stay." Jacob, overhearing from the porch, looked out at the horizon, his heart heavy and full all at once. He realized that every scar, every lonely night, had led him to this moment, to the family he never expected but always needed. In the years that followed, their story spread quietly through nearby towns. Folks spoke of the widow and the rancher, of how kindness had turned strangers into family. Some said it was fate, others called it a miracle. But for Jacob and Clara, it was simply love, earned, tested, and true. Their lives stood as proof that sometimes, the smallest act of mercy could change everything. When Jacob grew old, Samuel took over the ranch. The day Jacob passed, the sky burned gold with the setting sun, just like the day Clara first arrived. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering, "You kept your promise." His lips curved into a faint smile. "You did too," he breathed. Then, with peace in his eyes, he was gone. Yet even in death, his love lingered in every wooden beam, every field, every echo of laughter carried by the wind. Clara lived on for many years, watching Samuel raise his own family on that same land. And when people asked her how she'd survived, she would tell them, because one man didn't turn away. Her eyes would shine as she looked toward the horizon where it all began. "He saw my baby and said, then, stay." And those two words gave us a lifetime. The ranch became a symbol of compassion, a refuge for anyone in need. Travelers still stopped by, and Clara, older now but still strong, would greet them with a smile, offering food and warmth. Each time, she'd think of Jacob and whisper, "We're still saving lives, love." The wind would carry her words through the open fields, like a blessing. And so, the story of the poor widow and the rancher lived on, not as a tale of pity, but of redemption. A reminder that love often begins with a simple act of kindness, a door opened when all others have closed. Because sometimes, saving someone else is how we find the courage to save ourselves. And somewhere, beneath the wide, endless sky, Jacob's words still echoed through the wind, "Then stay."